Hello, Yalimalat everyone. My name is Sadiya Abjani, and I'll be the moderator for today's Critical Conversations. The Critical Conversations series has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. Before we begin, in the spirit of social justice, land acknowledgement, and recognizing the history and exploitation of Indigenous peoples, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I am speaking from the ancestral lands of the Mashpee Wampanoag, Akina Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Massachusetts tribal nations in the Boston area. Each of us on this call today are speaking from the territories of various Indigenous peoples and tribes, some treatied and some unceded. We believe the work we do in sessions like these are a part of our ongoing responsibility to acknowledge the ongoing harm that is done to Indigenous peoples on these lands, and working towards a society that is more just, equitable, and in keeping with our ethics as Ismaili Muslims. Today, we're talking about exploring living and dying in the West. Today's session is a book talk with the author, Dr. Parin Dossa. The book, entitled Social Palliation, Canadian Muslims Storied Lives on Living and Dying, is a pioneering study on living and dying as articulated by first-generation Iranian and Ismaili Muslim communities in Canada. Using ethnographic narratives, Dr. Parin Dossa makes a case for a paradigm shift from palliative care to social palliation. During this session, you will also see a Q&A box through which you can share additional questions or thoughts throughout the presentation. We'll try to address as many of the questions submitted during today's talk as we can. With that, I would love and have the honor and privilege to introduce to you our wonderful author. Dr. Parin Dossa, professor of anthropology, received her education on 3 continents: Africa, Britain, and North America. Her teaching and research interests include migration and diaspora, gender, health, and social palliation, ethnographic methods, and structural violence in war and peace. Her work on Muslim women in the homelands and diaspora has resulted in interrelated projects published in edited collections and scholarly journals. She is the author of A, Racialized Bodies, Disabling Words, Storied Lives of Immigrant Muslim Women, published in 2009. B, Politics and Poetics of Migration, Narratives of Iranian Women from the Diaspora, published in 2004. C, Afghanistan Remembers, Narratives of Violence and Culinary Practices, published in 2014. And D, Social Palliation, Canadian Muslims Storied Lives on Living and Dying, published in 2020. And there's a final one, Transnational Aging and Reconfiguration of Kin Work, published in 2017. So with that, I'm excited to start asking you questions and get to the meat of the session. Thank you so much for being on and speaking with us. Before we begin exploring your book, I'd like to take a second to understand more about what led you to this topic and the approaches that you took.
First of all, let me thank you for your kind words. I would like to acknowledge that I am also joining you from the unceded Coast Salish territory, the traditional territories of the Musquam, Squamish, Salewalu, and Kwakwitlam First Nations. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So in response to your question, I would want to relate a short narrative. One fine day, the director of BC Hospice Palliative Care Association phoned me and asked me if I would talk about cultural inclusivity in one of their conferences. As an anthropologist, I saw this as an opportunity to explore 2 interrelated questions. First, I asked myself, does not an exclusive focus on cultural inclusivity reify dynamic and diverse traditions of particularly the Muslims, and also noting that Islam is a global faith spanning time and space. Second, I wish to explore the contributions of Muslims to the existential question of what it is to live and die in a new country following displacement.
So to follow up on that, why did you choose to study women who are displaced and are nearing the end of their lives?
Well, first of all, I think the women in the audience will agree with me. Women do substantive amount of work behind the scenes. This work, I believe, need to be recognized, especially in the diasporic context. Women hold families together during times of crisis and its aftermath. And so my goal was not to focus exclusively on final stages of life, but I think it would be helpful if I gave you a full context of who Canadian Iranian and Canadian Ismaili Muslims are and what are their particular social locations. So when women from these communities, and I've not completely excluded men, when they migrated to Canada, they were in their 40s and 50s. Like other immigrants, they faced numerous challenges, such as non-recognition of their qualifications, sustaining networks of relationships to the extent possible, taking care of families, and settling down in a new place where they were subject to structural exclusion. As they aged, they found their lives were rendered redundant. Their desire to speak on essential issues. What are the forces that compromise our humanity? How do they foreground their experiential knowledge of integrity of life and death? As I was to learn, life cannot be lived without an understanding of its embeddedness in death. Death cannot be understood as being a discrete phenomena severed from life. To foreground these issues, research participants resorted to telling the stories that we will cover momentarily. But key questions that arose in my study are how do we acquire a politically informed and palpable understanding of the stories that emanate from the marginalized spaces of displacement? And how can we address the paradox by which affliction is perpetuated and medicalized by institutions established to relieve suffering in the first place?
And to explore this, what are some of the concepts that factored into your research?
Good question. So life, death, and dying, they affect us all as human beings. There is no question about that. Therefore, I made a conscious choice to frame my study in a way that speaks to us all. Critical to my study is the framework of caring. Acknowledging the work of fellow anthropologists, this is what I have to say, because I don't want to live caring on a kind of unilinear plane. I want to complicate this concept. And so this is what I would like to quote. Through care, we are positioned to participate in social life, materially and spiritually. And being cared for, we are accorded recognition and value. In relationships of care, we affirm our presence as human beings. Emotions are invested and worked through and become the grounds of interpersonal solidarity, which is a key concept in my work. Mutual and reciprocal forms of caring affirm our being in the world as to who we are, persons who are living lives that are fragile.
Wonderful. So your book is described using the term that it's ethnography. So what is an ethnography, and why did you choose this approach to your research?
So I invite all of you to become ethnographers. It is such an exciting field. You know, ethnography is a form of methodology that forms the foundation of the discipline of anthropology. Ethnographers take pride in their attempt to learn about their lives, learn about the lives of their research participants through multiple pedagogies. This is the key concept in ethnography. And these pedagogies are not just verbal, formal questions. They include participant observations, stories, memory work, everyday life, and language of the body. So these methods help us to gain insights on critical questions that anthropologists have sought to explore. What makes us human, and what are the forces that compromise our humanity?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that response. I want to be an ethnographer. So the title of your book is Social Palliation, which I admit is a new concept to me. I work in training palliative care companies, and social palliation is a fairly new concept. So this is a concept that you've developed through your research with the women you followed. Could you share a little bit more about this concept? What is it? And what's the difference between social palliation and palliative care? How is it perceived to be different?
I think that's a very important question. You know, the framework of social palliation actually expands the boundaries and parameters of palliative care. I did not want to critique palliative care per se, because it has a lot to offer in terms of compassionate care, in terms of dying with dignity. But what I want to recognize is that social palliation is actually refers to a life course from birth to death. This is the way it expounds the boundaries of palliative care. While recognizing the value of palliative care, my study participants made the following observations. And what I'm going to do is just summarize what they have to say. I often do that when I have a couple of narratives that touch on the same theme. So palliative care is offered during the last days of life, right? And it is usually confined to a clinical setting. The question that my study participants raised are, should not the reality of life with its trajectory of birth, growing old, and death be taken into consideration as a whole? Does not exclusive focus on death amount to severing it from life? What about the circumstances of people who have crossed the border from a developing to a developed world? The latter, they note, has disrupted their lives because the process of growing old has not been given recognition in terms of its full life course. Those of us who have crossed social, cultural, and geographical borders have alternative perspectives to offer, but these are dismissed as not being of much value. At most, there is interest in our culture, but this focus can reinforce our otherness, because an exclusive cultural lens can separate and rarefy our lives even more. So this is my summation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So in what ways is Islam relevant to social palliation?
Oh, critically, it's critically relevant. And I have been thinking about Islam for some time, because when I conduct research, I find that research participants, as well as mainstream organizations, policymakers, do not talk about faith traditions. I think in our secular neoliberal world, faith traditions have been subjugated. So Islam's relevance to palliative care cannot be underestimated. Islam, like other faith traditions, offers practical advice. I need to drink some water. So it offers practical advice and guidance on critical components of life, that is ethics of care and social justice. Its emphasis on holism, that is recognizing the integrity of body, mind, and soul, can enhance the work of palliative care practitioners. So what I want to quote here, and even if it means that I'll take a little bit of your time, is a letter written by Imam Ali to Malik al-Ashtar, the governor of Egypt. It is cited by Reza Shah Kazimi in Justice and Remembrance, published in 2007. The letter, which I consider to be an iconic form of governance, gives central space to socially marginalized people. So they are not categorized as being homogeneous. And so they are named in terms of the needy, the destitute, the afflicted, the orphans, the elderly, and the disabled. Now it would be differently abled. The rights are spelled out in the guidelines that Imam Ali gives to the governor. The letter's primary duty is to recognize that this constituency is in need of justice from you more than any other among your subjects. Hence the injunction, sit with them in public assembly with all due humility before God, your creator. This setting will give them the opportunity to speak in an uninhibited manner, free from the intervention of officers. I find the phrase free from the intervention of officers very critical, because we turn to policymakers and social organizations who sometimes assume that they know what cultural inclusivity is about. And here, Imam Ali is giving guidance that you must sit with them face to face. And then this is a very powerful statement. It states that a nation in which the rights of the weak are not protected will never be blessed. So it was COVID-19 lockdown that has this silver lining, because I came across this work during family discussion or scholarly works on Islam that otherwise we do not turn to. And this is one thought that I would like to all of us to consider, whether we, to the extent to which we are considering our heritage. And it has been muted in a Eurocentric ethos. So we need to remind ourselves that it was 1,410 years ago that the rights of the marginalized were spelled out. And yet today, the struggle for justice and equity continues. Black Lives Matter, advocacy work of indigenous people, and those of anti-racist organizations come to mind. It is telling to read that Imam Ali's response to the question, how should I lead them in prayer? Imam Ali responded, lead them by the weakest among you. But I want to make one more point. I'm not trying to, or in my work also, I'm not trying to foreground one faith tradition. I cannot overemphasize the point that other faith traditions also embody ethical principles. So what we need to do is facilitate what I refer to in my work as deep level conversations at a time when we are faced with numerous critical problems, climate change, right now, COVID-19 pandemic, racism, inequity, and injustice.
And I could hear you talk forever. There are moments like these where I feel so connected to my face. And speaking of things that are often muted in a Eurocentric context, based on your research, what does living and dying look like in displaced communities, and particularly in the Iranian communities and the Canadian Ismaili communities? Could you share some examples or stories from your books or from your book?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I think stories has formed the mainstay of my work. When I just take to stories, I think they just appeal to my emotion and to my sense of being in the world. So I'll say a few words about stories, okay? So first of all, stories restore our humanity. That is who we are as persons who are subject to certainty of death and uncertainty of life. Stories connect us in a way that make us realize that their stories are our stories, provided we all stand on the ground of vulnerability. Story helps us identify workings of larger forces as they make their way into the inner recesses of life. But at the same time, and this is the aspect that I appreciate about stories, is they reveal how people negotiate challenges of life, negotiations that have the potential to bring about transformative change. So in my work, I do emphasize the agency of my study participants. I have never, ever profiled them as victims. A singular story ultimately forms part of a collective whole, like streams merging into an ocean. So now, in terms of an example, I will go through a couple of stories, maybe three. One is um, Ismaili Muslim woman, and the other two are Iranian women. So the first story comes from Sakar, okay? Now she lived in Uganda, and as you know, there was the Asian exodus in 1971. So she was displaced with her family. She went to England, and she actually found a place that the settlement services located for her. It was in the what she referred to as the beautiful countryside. And also, we need to note political economic perspective that immigrants are desired for their labor. I mean, this is built into the policies of Western countries. And so Sakar found herself taking on waged work. In her homeland, she had taken care of an extended family and raised 5 children. And one particular aspect that she had pursued with enthusiasm and commitment was going to Jamaat Khana every day, twice a day. And she performed a substantial amount of service. But what happened in England is that there was no Jamaat Khana close by, and it wasn't open every day. And the other aspect was that she was cut off from a world of social relationships. We all value a network of relationships, and that is lacking in our lives. As we move more into the era of what I refer to as neoliberal global capitalism, that we can talk about, or we can just briefly discuss later on. So to be near Jamaat Khana, she then, her children applied to go to Canada, and then she came to Canada. And, she lived in an apartment with her husband near Jamaat Khana. So she could go to Khane, so to speak, every day. After a while, her husband passed away, and as she aged, she started experiencing falls. But prior to that, she still looked after her family. And in Canada, the norm is nuclear family structures. So she didn't live with her children, but she did take care of them in terms of making rotis, especially. So once she was hospitalized because of the fall, and the nurse informed her family that, it is best for you to put her in a nursing home because you guys are busy. You don't have time to look after her, and she'll be better off here. Well, Sakar's life was totally diminished when she moved into the nursing home. She was actually a number with a room. And she just went through a very difficult time. And now what the nurse and the society at large did not recognize is Sakhar's life trajectory, homeland experiences of displacement and reconfiguration of life in a new country. In the nursing home, Sakhar then started walking around corridors, calling for her deceased family members. Her cries for help in terms of being cut off from the world of social relationships from Khane were not heard. She passed away after a period of 4 years. Her suffering amounted to severance of death from life. It is best captured by an observation made by a fellow anthropologist by the name of Jackson. The absence of social relationships can reduce a person to mere objectivity, for this implies that he or she no longer exists in any active social relationship to others, but solely in passive relationship to himself or herself on the margins of the public realm. I think we'll have occasion to talk about this theme as we proceed. But my second story comes from Nazi. Now, meet Nazi. She's a Canadian-Iranian woman, very vibrant, energetic, and she's now in her 70s. And she lives in an apartment by herself because she's a widow. And whenever I would visit her, she served me with Iranian tea in transparent glasses made in a large pot that for her symbolized togetherness and connectivity. So Nazi feels that life has gone not too well for her. In her words, I helped others to overcome their isolation. Now, in my old age, I feel alone and isolated. So let's look at the context as to what happened. When she came to Canada, she was in her 40s. She saw that Iranian women were isolated, they were lonely. Some of them were feeling depressed. So she decided to set up English as a second language class twice a week, and she had to negotiate with the service organization. Initially, she offered to work without pay because this project was very important. So Iranian women, older and younger women, got together, at this facility, and not only did they learn English, but socialization was a very critical component. They even celebrated life events like birth of babies or weddings, commemoration of people who had passed away, and the festival of Nowruz that is so very important for them. So what happened was that as Nazi grew older, she developed a condition of arthritis, and she, was not that mobile. She felt isolated because the friendships she had formed, those women that were her co-patriots had passed away or were too old, and she just stays mostly in her apartment. But not without, doing some kind of work that would make her family and probably others remember her. She collates pictures of her families that's now dispersed, in the diaspora. She talks to her two daughters who are in Toronto, and she, actually gives them tips on health and healing. She reads, she watches Iranian programs, but also in English programs and so forth. Her daughters have invited her to live with them in Toronto, but she refuses. She thinks that she will not feel at home, going there and living with them. And this is the sentiment that I came across over and over again, so this is where she is. And so this actually is her story. And what I want to say is that She worries that, what would happen to her if her arthritis gets worse. But this is where it stands. The third story, which I will go through very quickly because I am very much aware of time, is again an Canadian Iranian woman by the name of Goli. So she asked me to meet in the place, like we ethnographers, we meet our study participants. We don't just conduct interviews. So she asked me to meet in the place that BC Housing had offered her. And she said, I need to find a place because where I'm living now is very expensive. It's very high rent and I need subsidized housing. They offered her a unit in an apartment complex that's on the ground floor. So Goli said, well, if I move in here, first of all, I would have fear that they might be breaking. Second, she says that the carpets were, kind of smelly and really torn, but they were not replaced. The organization refused to replace them. But third, most important for her, was that if she moved in here with her husband, she would be cut off from the minimal social relationships that she had cultivated while she was living in Lonsdale, which is on North Shore, a very popular place for Canadian Iranians. And she said that, well, this apartment was in a hill, so she would be far from the bus stop. She would not be able to go out and socialize as she did, walking and talking. She knew a realtor and she would often go to his office and chat with him. He was Iranian. And that most important, there was a doctor's office close by. And she also felt that she would not be able to go on walks, because this place was on a hill. So again, Goli's story, in fact, reveals, how important it is for us to actually engage into effecting a paradigm shift from palliative care to social palliation, because social palliation would mean that we have a caring society. And the issue here is that I'm just very interested in Goli's message. Her message is that to live in a house, it must open up into a world of social relationships. If you occupy a house that's just a physical building, as was the case with what she was offered, then it's not a home. And I thought this was her contribution. If policymakers were to listen to her, they would begin to recognize the importance of, living in a place and living in a milieu that opens up into social relationships, however minimal that they have been. Now, having discussed these three stories, I remain convinced of the moral imperative to speak up. Otherwise, we fail to see how life slides into non-life, courtesy of Vinadas. This author states that not to relate to a person's suffering is not a failure of the intellect, but it's a failure of the spirit. The question is, how do we go about addressing this issue? My response is to consider the foundation story of humankind, the integrity of death in life and life in death. I argue that such an awareness fosters social palliation, where life, jivan, and death, maran, remain in the forefront.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Something I noticed in all three stories, you mentioned Kane, you mentioned Navroz. How can our sacred traditions create pathways to help speak to ideas of life and death?
Okay, again, a very critical question. So I would state that sacred traditions compel us to listen afresh to the dilemmas of life that forms the core theme of my work. Critical point here is that these traditions take us into a world beyond the normative discourses and practices, what we take as our comfort zone. We find it hard to move away from the comfort zone. We find it hard to use a different kind of language when we want to give expression to certain issues, because this is what we are socialized into. So through musicality, rhythms, metaphors, and sounds, sacred traditions highlight the predicament of brevity and vulnerability of life on earth. So let us just share a few examples, namely Ginans, a tradition of South Asian Ismaili Muslims, not overlooking the viable tradition of Qasidas, Ismailis from Central Asia, along with the corpus of Persian mystical poetry. I am mindful of the fact that the English rendition, examples of which I will cite, does not do justice to the wealth of wisdom included in these traditions. So let us keep in mind that these sacred traditions are to be recited as opposed to translated text. So the first one goes as this: Ugamiya sohi dina athamia, hare fulia sohi karamai. Chuniya mindara dari pade, hare janamiya sohi marajai. Hare mana bamaratu lobio, hare maya mamate lobano. Chara divasano pekaro, hare akhara khat hojana. I find this very powerful because it is kind of embedded in metaphors, and so are sacred traditions. So just as the day has risen, it will set. The flowers that have bloomed will fade. The mansions that have been built will crumble. Those who are born will die. So why are you not generous and kind? You are caught in the web of the material world. You have 4 days. Ultimately, you will turn into ashes. The second one is Ejipakato sahebaji nunamache, tene jampiye sasa usas. Durama dekho dillamahe vase, jema champa fulamahe vas. So purity is the name of the divine. Meditate with your every breath. Do not look far. The divine resides in you like the scent in a flower. Now, verses from the Rumi. And I did find that, these verses were cited by my study participants. So Rumi says, when you do things from your soul, you will feel a river moving in you, a joy. Raise your words, not voice. It is rain that grows flowers, not thunder. Knock, and he'll open the door. Vanish, and he'll make you shine like the sunfall. And he'll raise you to the heavens. Become nothing, and he'll turn to you into everything. And a verse from Sadi: a raindrop dripping from a cloud, ashamed it saw the sea. Who am I? Where is the sea? It said, as it saw itself from the eyes of humility, a shell embraced it and made him a pearl. And another quick verse from Sadi: one who has vanity and conceit in his head, imagine not that he will ever hear the truth. Human beings are members of a whole, in creation of one essence and one soul. If one member is afflicted with pain, other members uneasy will remain. If you have no sympathy for human pain, the name of humanity you cannot retain. So, I didn't want to leave these verses just as they are. So I decided to kind of identify some thematic orientations so that I hope it creates space for reflection, a baseline for deep level conversations across traditions, not only within one tradition. So I'm just going to cite 3 or 4, not all of them, but my thematic reading of these verses, first of all, indicates that sacred traditions recognize that life is fragile and uncertain. Glimpses of the corpus open space for an ethics of mutual care. They invoke the imaginative possibility of being awakened to human existence. They express existential issues of life along with the values by which it ought to be lived. I think I won't continue because I'm very much aware of the time.
No. We have plenty of time. Please continue.
I just probably take more time the other questions.
Okay. I I can listen to you speak forever. So how have ideas of living and dying changed amongst diasporic communities? What made them change? And what are some of the implications of these changes?
Yeah, that's something that must be addressed, because diasporic communities, as they undergo challenges, negotiate trials and tribulations of life, they also create pathways for transformative change. So in my book, I have sought foremost to first of all establish the hitherto unrecognized link between displacement and living and dying. Now, I have not actually identified this theme, on an abstract plane. This is what my participants suggested through their storied lives. So other than loss of livelihood and disruption of lives, the storied lives of study participants reveal a socially bare landscape relate to their experiences of isolation and loneliness. I think I should pause here and perhaps comment a bit on why is it a socially bare landscape. I'm sure all of you have this question. And the reason is that we are embedded in a neoliberal global capitalistic world. Now, what it means is that, first of all, it is the economic model that, that actually dictates what we do for most part of our lives, especially when we are young. And the economic model, as it is in place, does not necessarily include issues of morality or ethics of care or compassion, unless billionaires decide to do some charity work. But it was Paul Farmer who said that every time a billionaire comes into being, thousands of people are impoverished. It just doesn't happen that somebody becomes a billionaire, in an abstract way. So neoliberal global capitalism, as it translates into the lives of diasporic communities, results in the younger people wanting to build careers, realizing that if they did not pursue this goal at the highest level possible, so to speak, then the struggles that their parents and grandparents went through will continue. So in other words, they strive to establish a viable career. But what happens is that this is at the expense of not being able to spend time with particularly the older aging generation. And so this is why the refrain I came across in my work talking to Canadian Iranians and Canadian Ismaili Muslims was that the older people, as they had aged in Canada, were isolated, they felt lonely. Even if the children were around, the level of interaction was not that intense. And feeling isolated and lonely is an existential issue. I don't think that society should normalize this and render it into a world where it becomes socially invisible. So this is an issue that we can reflect on, and maybe we can discuss this during question time. But neoliberal global capitalism puts emphasis on self-care, on individualism, and it does not actually substantively foster a world of social relationships, a social milieu where your life is acknowledged and validated, particularly as you age. So for my participants, losing a social milieu reduced their capacity to share their understanding of life conjoined with death and the wealth of knowledge and wisdom acquired generationally. This is very, very sad, because here we have a generation who do have, this experiential knowledge that they acquired from, generationally and also through border crossing experiences. And yet, this body of knowledge is not validated to a large extent. So the participants did not take death as a discrete unit to be taken care of when someone passes away. Participants came forward with the hope that their lives would ultimately make a difference, initiating what I refer to as facilitating deep-level conversations with readers and stakeholders. By deep-level conversations, I don't mean boardroom conversations. I mean conversations that can take place in the context of everyday life.
Wonderful. So in your book, you mentioned the term social wounding that can often be found in the migration and settlement of immigrant communities. And you just talked a little bit about the parts of life that come from border crossing and those stories that come out of that. Could you share more about what this concept is, this concept of social wounding?
Yeah, I find this concept to be very useful, not only in terms of the fact that if one is wounded, then stories emanate from the body. And these stories are very powerful. So social wounding, as I have discussed in my book, it reveals the dynamic interplay between estrangement and belonging, between being in the world and falling out of it. The construct of social wounding helps us to understand the point that the experience of isolation and loneliness enmeshed in the everyday lives of study participants must not be accepted as the norm. Social wounding suggests productive possibilities in the form of alternative pathways. Wounds need to heal. The issue at the core of social wounding is not that the study participants are rendered passive. On the contrary, their attempts to remake their everyday worlds are commendable. It is in this vein that they speak as wounded storytellers that perform a two-way task, revealing the effect of structural forces at work, along with their attempts to reconstruct their lives in small ways, the significance of which must not be underestimated. As Ranjit Guha has expressed it, there are many small voices present within the civil spaces. It is our responsibility to hear these voices if we are to take part in healing wounds. Lest this sounds too abstract, I will just quickly go through Mirza's narrative, just a fraction. Mirza is actually a Canadian Iranian, and he kind of is a Baha'i. So being persecuted, he was granted refugee status in Canada. And he found himself very isolated because he did not speak the language. He had a son who was differently disabled. He had to go to the doctors and wait for 1.5 hours. But there was one particular, quote that I would like to relate to you, and that is about caring. And he's actually speaking to the caregivers, to the nurses, and he tells them, remember that the patient that you are taking care of is someone's sister, is a daughter, is a mother, and is a worker. And all these roles should fuse to form a picture so that the patient is not someone who is just ill, but a patient who has a life. And I just wanted to cite this example in the way of, what social wounding means, because on the one hand, he is wounded, but on the other hand, he also has this wonderful insights in his story.
You've shared so much throughout this this session, and I just have one final question. Where do we go from here, and how can we begin to heal and support our aging communities?
So earlier, I made a comment that we are too immersed in using kind of a vocabulary that does not open up into the world of social care, that does not allow us to recognize that we live lives that are holistic, that, through sacred traditions and our heritage, we should resort to using metaphors and symbols. And I think they are powerful in their own way. So what I'm going to do is use a metaphor that I have used in one of my, in this particular book. And I will just read it out and see what you make of it. So consider a vase of flowers placed on a kitchen table, a scene I often came across during my interviews with women. I often found flowers to be fading in various stages in their lives. Some were relatively fresh while others were drooping, yet others were shedding their petals. Surrounding the flowers were evergreens. Each flower has its own story, the foundation of which would be the soil in which it grew, the amount of sunshine and water it received, along with tender care or its lack. The flowers speak to us about life and death. At one time, they were fresh and desirable. Now, as they are fading, they are looked upon with different eyes with the view that they will be disposed of soon. But we need to pause and pay attention to their silent message. Each flower enhances the colors, the shapes, and the textures of the others, telling a collective story of how singular lives relate to others without losing their characteristics. An important aspect is that of the green leaves being there for the fading flowers to support them. This vignette stands by itself for the reader to glean its message about sociality and interconnectivity. So I talked about severance of life and death. I think the metaphor of the flower, in fact, indicates that it is not in our interest to consider these to exist in two separate realms. So singular stories effect a shift from an I to a we, and the we embodies intergenerational relationships integral to what makes us human. It is we aspect that protagonists of the stories found wanting. They directed their efforts to remake a home and draw out its significance for life and death. Now, a subject matter that may be articulated discursively, but is not far from the surface. So the metaphor of the vase brings home two main points. It highlights the theme threaded in my work, namely establishing a caring society where each singular piece contributes to the well-being of a collective body through reciprocity and interconnectivity. It reveals the need to speak a new language. Only then can we effect a paradigm shift from an uncaring world to the one that is infused with qualities of compassion and care, affirming our humanity as persons occupying planet Earth. As Rumi expresses it, speak a new language and the world will be a new one. In case this sounds ambitious, I would like to quote from Maulana Hazar Imam's speech delivered during the Aga Khan University convocation in Karachi, 2007. So here is the quotation. The reason for the preeminence of Islamic civilizations lay neither in accident of history nor in acts of war, but rather in their ability to discover new knowledge, to make it their own and to build constructively upon it. They became the knowledge societies of their time. So the question that I to pose for all of us, including myself, is, can we work towards creating this new knowledge by changing the discourse that we are accustomed to? Can be, the discourse could include metaphors, and sacred traditions as we understand them. And can we also, along with the discourse by itself is not sufficient, along with the discourse, can we also engage into practices that would lead to the creation of a social milieu where the relationship between people is mutual, and that it would be mutual care, and it would be reciprocity. And an important aspect that I think we need to address as a diasporic community is that we must not remain within the discrete sphere of our heritage or our faith. We should actually expand the boundaries of our heritage and faith so that it does form part of mainstream conversations. It does form part of conversations we have with health providers, with palliative care practitioners. So they begin to see that we are not the other, that we have a substantial contribution to make to society, not only in terms of careers, but beyond that, responding to the question, what makes us human? So we must all strive to build a better world in our small ways. And I want to emphasize, don't consider this to be a mammoth task, just in small ways. And the small ways come about in the context of everyday life as we interact with neighbors, our peers, kith and kin, and co-workers. And this is what I tell my students. They always ask me, well, how do we go about building a better world? And I always tell them that, I'm not suggesting that you take on this particular project in terms of wanting to change the world, but just within your sphere of influence. So I think I will end here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for those thoughts and for sharing that information. I know in my work, I work quite closely with care providers. And I think that's one of the things that we're constantly sharing with them is that these individuals, even in death, have so much to offer. Their stories, their narratives, and they must be understood within the context of the big and breathtaking lives they led. So I really appreciate you sharing this with all of us, sharing your research, and most importantly, sharing those stories with us. With everything that's been spoken, we've received a few questions from the audience, and I would really love to hear your insights on them. So I'm going to go ahead and take us to our first question. How are diasporic communities more marginalized in the healthcare system? And what are some of the examples that you've uncovered in your book?
Okay, that's a good question. Yes, marginalization is an issue, but I think that we must not again homogenize, kind of an understanding that all diasporic members of all diasporic communities are marginalized. Mm-hmm. There are people, younger people who speak the language, who become conversant with the vocabulary of medical technology, can negotiate their way into the health system. But the important point is that by and large, the health system that is that we have in place is Eurocentric. Mm-hmm. It is not. It doesn't have a baseline. It does not have a foundation to substantially and structurally include the aspirations, the cultures in a deep sense of the word, and the religious traditions of minorities. So I think it's best if I give you an example. I don't want to sort of talk too much in abstract terms. The example comes from my book. There is this Canadian-Iranian woman who came to Canada with, with certain kind of constraints. She's differently abled, and she is on a wheelchair. And the first point that she made is that, I am not wheelchair bound. I am a user of a wheelchair. And then what happened is that once her wheelchair broke, and she reported this to the service organization, and they did not repair it for 2 weeks. And partly because, she did not actually, she was, she didn't really speak English. She had to take a translator with her whenever she talked to service organizations, and partly because she was not conversant with the health system. Because if I look at her life in Iran, she was a very resourceful person. She raised 4 children on a wheelchair with the assistance of her husband. So it's not that she did not have the knowledge and understanding of what should be done, but they somehow or the other, they did not pay attention to her. She sat for 2 weeks on the sofa because they told her that the service worker is on vacation. And so what, her name is actually Firuze. So what she did was she actually made a statement. She said, well, I sat on the sofa for 2 weeks. That prevented me from doing my work of cooking, of looking after my children, of going to my English as a second language classes, of taking the bus and going shopping. And so, and they were on vacation. So essentially the point she's making is that not being able to access the health system has meant that she was constrained. But she doesn't just kind of make statements about this. She actually shows the world, her society, that she is not disabled the way they think she is. Because when she says, I sat on the sofa and I could not do the work that I just noted, it means that I'm not disabled. I am just like any other mother, any other wife who's looking after my children. But because she was not able to access the health system, this was the outcome, that she did not let this opportunity go by without implicating the system. So there were other examples like that too. So I would say the scholarship suggests that racialized minorities do confront barriers and are not able to access health system in the way that would make them feel comfortable, that would affirm their, who they are as persons, namely with histories and who their parents have crossed borders, internal as well as external. So I think the issue is there, and I think that in terms of the paradigm shift towards social palliation, we need to also address this concern.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that response. We had another question from the audience. Based on your research, do you have any advice for people in their 40s or older to be in a better mindset socially as they grow older?
Yes, I think the better mindset can come about socially if we draw upon our heritage, if we draw upon our traditions. Then our interactions with our neighbors, with our kids, with our kin, with our co-workers, with the kind of volunteer work we do, I think would be totally, on a different plane. Because I think what is lacking in our lives, and my response to this question is that we are not using the vocabulary which is totally different from the one that we are accustomed to, that would help us to recognize and validate our being in the world. And I think this is lacking, for some, both members of the community. For some, we have lost our mother tongue. But that does, even if we use English or French or Farsi, that does not mean that in these languages we cannot find room for expressing who we are. And I think being in touch with the innermost selves of our being would make a difference as we grow old. We all need to find meaning in life. And this meaning requires work. This acquisition of this meaning requires work.
Another question that just came in: how do you think we can further integrate our sacred traditions into this Western biomedical model that exists? How do you feel that possibly multi-generational housing is aiding with this, or about, maybe even on a smaller, less institutional scale? How do we integrate those sacred traditions into care provision?
Okay, that's a very good question. I'm glad that it has been raised. I think we should have the courage to talk about traditions to the outside world. For example, I'm now doing some research on anti-Muslim violence here in Vancouver, and there is one, actually Canadian-Iranian woman. She actually was subject to derogatory comments. And instead of confronting this person who was making these comments, and she's actually a nurse, she left the hospital where she was working, and her last words to this person was that, "Do you know that I pray and I fast?" That's all that she said. And I thought that was so very powerful. And there was another person I came across, and she said, "Well, when I talk to people, I don't always say that, oh, I am marginalized, or I will be the target of structural exclusion. I just try to be a good human being, kind to persons." And then they come and ask me, where do you get these values from? And at times you collect anecdotes, there are many, and just share them with the outside world, with your caregivers. Even if they do not acknowledge it, just form it into a habit, so they would recognize that you also have a tradition. And I think that biomedical model is very problematic because of the Cartesian dichotomy between body and mind, and its failure to recognize that people have a soul. And if not soul, then if it's not, they don't always use the word soul, but at least to be able to relate to nature, the mountains, the rivers, all this constitutes our appreciation of the world outside that of human relationships. Because human relationships, if they exist outside nature, then they are devoid of substantial values of life. So human beings are embedded in nature, and this is where you can use the term soul in a broader context. So I would say, have the courage in your everyday life interactions and talk about your faith in ways that you feel comfortable. Highlight, some of the anecdotes, the metaphors. Hazrat Imam's speeches, I think, would be a very good start. And speeches are okay. We do not cite firmans, but speeches, are actually meant for the world. And the kind of work that Hazrat Imam is doing is exemplary. It has just shown us the path. And so I would say, just change your vocabulary, change your practices, and you will find that not only are you making a difference in the larger world of either biomedicine or palliative care, but also difference in your own life, because this is how you will feel enlightened, and you will find that you have this meaning that I think modern society is searching for through different avenues: art, music, appreciation for nature, usage of symbols, poetry, metaphors. So use poetry, metaphors, whatever you acquire through your reading, through your interactions with friends. That would be my response.
Wonderful. Thank you. Our final question from the audience is regarding a comment you made about living in a liberal capitalistic society where individualism often takes over. This individual asks, what are some ways that we can make certain changes in our lives and in our work to counteract that?
Well, I think we need to make time for family. We need to make time for social interactions, either with neighbors or peers. And ensure sometimes, I think, many times we can just go back to our homeland life. Maybe the younger generation can, ask their parents or grandparents what the homeland life was like. And I remember, growing up in Uganda, or recently my visits to Kenya and Tanzania, I noticed that when you are on the street, people talk to you. Say, jambo, habari yako, mazuri sana, and this kind of conversation, takes place. And even if you are aware that there are lots of issues in the developing world through colonization and imperialism, people are, friendly, and they talk to you and they listen to you. Even when we went to, hospital once, the Aga Khan Hospital in Nairobi, there were some African workers, and we wanted to go and see us, somebody who had been hospitalized. He just walked with us, right up to the room, and we had such a wonderful conversation with him. So I think that we have not, like, neoliberal model has not opened spaces for us. It just consumes our labor, for the purpose of production. So we need to be aware of this. And I do have a PowerPoint that I would like to show, it's very short, but after you finished, all the questions, finished raising all the questions.
So we are done with the questions. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
So this is calligraphy, right? So Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. But, I just wanted to show our heritage, and I know that there are some Muslims, like there is a center at SFU, and that holds the lessons in calligraphy. And some of the Muslims do, engage into this. And it is so beautiful. And, this is the kind of, it's an example of the heritage that we talked about, that we can share with our peers. So second one. So I have in my book, I have a section on legacies of living and dying. And I have just kind of have a note there that, every reader can open up the metaphors and read them in the way that they feel speaks and resonates with their life trajectories. So, next one. So these are the, this is Sakhar's last breaths, death in life. And 2 weeks before she passed away, she drew this. So it gave me the opportunity to substantiate what I have said. Let's move on. So this is a dying daughter remembers her father. So this is written in Gujarati. And I wanted to highlight this, show how much, the wealth of information that would be included in such a script. And people don't just die, without leaving a legacy. And, Barbara Meyerhoff's work comes to mind when she went to California and did some work with older Jewish men and women. They drew murals and they wrote stories to leave a legacy. So there's another aspect that I think we can keep in mind. This would enrich us as well, because these stories, we keep them with us. They become embedded in our memories. And this is how we can relate to our tradition. Okay, next one. So it's a 10-year-old Zoe. She remembers her Nanima. I'll just read the first one. So those who left are not lost. For before she left, she planted a seed and watched as it grow of all the past love she felt for you. So take those, I think one line is missing there. Those who wander away are not lost, for they have a home in your, I can't read the last line, and nothing that ever happens can rip that home apart. So I think the reason why I wanted to show this, I think when there is a death in the family, then encourage the children to write poetry or to write a story. So, then they remember these things. It becomes, this is also heritage, because it's, memory is not frozen in the past. It lives in the present. And this is how children, learn to actually more about who they are, who their grandparents were, and what they can actually find aspects that would form part of our heritage. So let's move on. I just wanted to give an example of heritage. And this is intergenerational transmission of knowledge. And, I have they are 2.5 years old. And I just took these poses just to show that this is also a responsibility that we have to actually take on to ensure that the sacred traditions are being passed on to our children. It is happening, but I just wanted to re-emphasize. But again, it's happening in ruptured space, because if you take the lives of children as they grow older, okay, they have school, then they have extracurricular activities, then they have homework. So where's the time? So we can be resourceful. Okay, last one, I think is the last one. This is the watch house, the First Nations watch house. And what I really found intriguing, like I walk here every day, what I found intriguing, and there's a vision quest that takes place in the watch house. And during this time, the person who undertakes this quest, he does not eat for 4 days. And so during this vision quest, I was told that they connect with the world of spirits. So this is another example. So what I want to emphasize, based on the questions that were asked, people do have traditions, they do have heritages, but they remain so isolated within their discrete spaces. So what I want to emphasize is how we can engage into, interaction among traditions. And it is only this way that we'll be able to bring about any kind of substantive transformation. And so I'm going to emphasize that our heritage should not remain within an isolated sphere, whereby, I just talk to my children and that's about it. We should try and, be courageous and ensure that also people from the larger society come to recognize us, not only for our qualifications, but who we are as persons and our contribution to what is the meaning of human existence and how life and death are conjoined. That's it. Thank you.
There we go, unmuted. Thank you so much, Dr. Dossa, for your time, your brilliance, your work. Thank you for the call to all of us to be ethnographers, to document the stories of others. And thank you for the call to share our own stories and the importance of metaphor and sharing our traditions. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the audience for joining us today. Hopefully, this is just the start of this critical conversation. Today was such a treat for me, as I hope it was for all of you that are watching, and thank you again for joining. We do have a couple of announcements before you go. I'm going to copy and paste some resources into the chat box for you. They are straight from Dr. Dossa. Hopefully you can check some of these out. I would definitely highly suggest the very last one. I use that quite a bit in my work as well. Please look out for more info from on the ITREB USA webpage and social media pages for young adult conversations this week in our next critical conversation. And finally, please, please, please take the survey at the end of the session that'll pop out on your screen as you leave. Thank you so much for joining, and Yali Madat, everyone. Have a wonderful Sunday.